Hello, now I'm going to talk about the software process models. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of different process models that are common in the software engineering world. Some of them are old-fashioned, I would say, and they basically continue to be referred as a way to describe some type of development, but probably is not very common today, at least in their pure form. Okay, but is a way basically to define one type of development process, although maybe it's not so fashionable today. But the way I'm going to describe this to you is by showing the relation between stages and activities. As I told you, stages are points of macro management, and activities, you do macro management with activities. So it's all they are related, okay? And so the first one is the waterfall model. And the relation with the waterfall model is quite well known. It's probably one of the first ones. And there's a one-to-one relation between the activity and the stage. So the way to look at it, for instance, you have the waterfall, so it's a one-to-one relationship between stages and activities. For instance, if you look a pure, of course, then you will find different variations of it. Okay, but in a pure, basically, you have one stage that you do all the activities of requirements, and you finish this stage. So the milestone is that requirements are done, and you close the requirements. And then you do for the next phase, and the next phase you receive as input the requirements, and you do the design. And then you say the design is done. And so you define this as a waterfall in the sense that you go through these different stages, and you go through these different stages, and in each stage you generate a product. And the product is, all the activities are of one type, so are activities of requirements, activities of design, and people usually say that one of the big problems here, you don't have feedback cycles, so that if during the implementation you realize that something is not okay in the requirements, then you say, well, requirements are finished, are closed, and you cannot change them. In reality, people that apply these kind of things, they actually, reality is more open and manageable than just a theoretical description of it. And so they say, well, waterfall model also describes feedback models. But okay, I'm focusing on something more pure, and what I'm really saying is that you do requirements, and when you do requirements, you do requirements. Okay, and then you go for design, and actually there are no, this is very nice to divide work, because people that, very nice, okay, but people that do design actually do not need to talk to people with do requirements. They just change documentation. These guys produce documentation with what is the requirement specification. These guys read the documentation and produce another documentation that is intermediate languages, right? That is a software architecture, and these guys are the design of the system, and these guys read the design plus the requirements and do the implementation, and these guys read the code and do and of course, and also read the requirements and design and do the verification. But actually, is production chain. The main idea is the production chain. So it's more related with more traditional ways of developing software, where you believe that actually communication between people is not that important, and you can optimize locally the quality of the development. So you can optimize the design, because you just focus on design, because then you can optimize the requirements. But there's not a you do not optimize them together. Okay. Then you have another one that is incremental development. And in incremental development, the relation between stages and activities, that the activities actually in the stage, the goal of the stage is is a deliver. So you're gonna, while here is the activity, so you do a particular activity during the stage. Here you try to deliver something. So actually you divide your software development process into chunks, and each chunk you just deliver functionality, you deliver value. Well, what is the goal of it? Basically is to have feedback, right? You have feedback from the client. So, of course, inside an incremental development, probably you can do a waterfall model, right? Because for this increment, you do requirements, you do everything, okay? But the idea is that you just divide your project into small projects so that you can have feedback cycles, okay? And all the agile approach we talk actually follow an incremental development approach. So for incremental development, we'll find something. We have, I think I have a link here to it. Okay, you have iterative and incremental development, and basically you will learn here. Actually, I don't have the link here. Is the link to the same page? But the point here is you define chunks of functionality, and then you can decide different ways to do it. You can decide that each chunk, so each iteration, okay, is iteration is of the incremental development actually adds some quality, adds some values. A sprint is an example of it, of an incremental development. Then you have another approach that is a reusable, reuse-oriented software engineering. And in this case, you have a main stage before you start, where actually you try to define a reusable architecture. So it's this idea that you don't develop software from scratch. You use things. So the first thing you do, you have a first stage where it's actually what you do is just to identify all the reusable artifacts that build your system, that will be that define the skeleton of your system. And then after that, you can do incremental development in this context, or adaptation, or depends. For instance, if you just realize that you can identify a set of components that are already provide what you need, so then development is quite short, okay, because everything is just customization of a few things. But of course, this is gonna depend on how able you are to reuse existing artifacts to solve your problem. Okay, but the idea is that you have this main stage where you build a reusable architecture. Okay, and then we have Boehm's spiral model, where the main stage is based on risk management, and we have seen already this when we talk about requirements. And so the main point here is I think it's here. So the main point is that you do a risk analysis in each steps of your development. So it's is the spiral model. So we'll find that for each one of the steps, you have for each one of the cycles, so something like this that we looked already. So for all these part of the development is about identifying risks, evaluating risks, so that when you actually do the development, you already have done prototyping. So it's really driven by, so this is the main stage where you do whatever you are doing, whatever you are doing, feasibility or requirements or design or implementation, before you start, you apply the techniques that you learn about risk management. You identify risks, you define prototypes to mitigate the risks, to address them, or whatever it's necessary. Okay? So it's very it's driven by try to have a high quality in the solution, okay, and try to avoid failure by looking in advance for all the problems that can occur. So it's an approach where you have this risk analysis. So before you enter in these particular phases of the development, you really have identified everything that it's necessary to do. Of course, people that do incremental development, they say that, well, I do the same in the sense that if I start with a very short increment of my functionality, actually I'm doing this, but I'm evaluating the risks. So I have this big project to do. So it makes sense to pick something that I start with something that where actually this is part of development, but it's also prototype because it's prototyping, because I just pick that part that says, well, if the project is gonna fail, it's because I'm probably gonna not be able to address that, and then that's the way you do. So it's interesting to see these different models, and of course you can address the same problems in different ways. Okay, using different variations of the models. And the final one, I think the final one I have is one that was quite famous for a while when with the big boom of UML. The same guys that define UML, they define the rational unified process. And here the idea is that a stage, a milestone, corresponds to verifying where you achieve some level of knowledge about your product. Okay, and they have a very, very nice picture, okay, that I can show it to you, not from here. Okay, I can show it from here. This is from Rational, and this is from Wikipedia. And what you see here, so these are the phases. They define 4 phases: inception, elaboration, construction, and transition. And what you do here, this is the type of activities. And so this is not actually waterfall, because you're not doing all the modeling or all the requirements or all the implementation together. No, you define the first goal first, and the first goal, which is the first milestone that is related with inception, is asks this question, tries to answer this question. So this knowledge is, can we build a product that solves the business? Can we build a software product that solves the business problem? Okay, and what they say is that to answer this, you need to do a lot of business modeling, for instance. You need to do a fair amount of requirements. But probably you also need to be a little bit of design, a little bit of implementation, tests, and deployment. And so what you see is along the different phases, the amount of activities of one type you need to do change. And that's what's interesting. So what is the goal of the second phase? What is the milestone? Can we build? So here you conclude. You're going to conclude whether you can the product makes sense from the business point of view. And if it makes sense, now the next stage is just to define the architecture of the product. And to define the architecture, you don't do only architecture the way we think in a waterfall model. You're going to do more business model to understand a little bit better what are the type of requirements you have and requirements. And you do a lot of design, yes. And then you start doing implementation. Why? Because it's difficult to do design without testing with doing implementation. So you do implementation. the amount of implementation you do increases here. And finally, you start doing tests. And then, if you finish this milestone and you achieve the knowledge that you can actually have an architecture for this project, you define the construction phase where you have several iterations, and actually is the implementation. And for implementation, of course, it reduces the amount of requirements, okay, and it reduces the amount of design, but keeps doing some design, yeah, and you do a lot of implementation here. And they divide the implementation into increments of functionality. Okay, so it's incremental in this phase. Okay, so, but at the end, well, maybe it's not incremental because they do not explicitly say that you should deliver it. Okay, and then the end you have the transition phase. So here we have implemented the system, and here is that can we deploy the system. So you do deployment here, and of course you do a little bit of implementation and so on. So it was a process model that was quite followed for a while. Actually, people just because they actually have some good ideas about this idea of knowledge, of gathering knowledge by doing development, but very probably they delay a lot the deployment, and then there was the merge of all these agile approaches, and that actually do the same. Okay, so what you see here is that they do all the types of activities inside one inside a single phase, but then the phases are very short, and they are you have a rapid, quick feedback cycles. Okay, I hope you enjoyed